The war that should have been lost. The war on Velmera 7 was supposed to be over by now. That was what the HFY High Command had believed when they sent their forces to claim the world. The battle was a formality, just another footnote in the long history of galactic conquest. After all, the humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded on all sides. Yet, for reasons beyond logical comprehension, they were still fighting. General Vornix of the HFY Dominion surveyed the battlefield from his command outpost, his bioluminescent tendrils pulsating in irritation. The planet's rocky surface was scared from the endless bombardments, entire cities reduced to smoldering craters. The human forces had no orbital support, no reinforcements, and barely any functioning technology left. Their ammunition should have run out days ago. And yet, here they were, still resisting, still making war. Vornix turned his attention to the latest intelligence reports. His elite war beasts, engineered to be the ultimate predators, had been killed by humans using nothing but sharpened debris and crude firebombs. His heavily armored shock troops had been bludgeoned to death with salvaged metal pipes and bricks. Even his advanced drone units, equipped with plasma cannons, had been disabled by slingshots and thrown rocks, as if the humans were some primitive pre-spacefaring species. It was maddening. On the battlefield below, Captain Elias Kane crouched in the ruins of an old industrial site, sweat dripping from his dirt-streaked face. His squad, what remained of it, was scattered throughout the rubble. They were low on everything. No bullets, no explosives, no reinforcements. All they had left was sheer human stubbornness. Kane pressed his comm against his ear. "Hawthorne, report." A crackling voice came through. "Still breathing, sir. Just took out one of their walkers with a steel beam, and a whole lot of bad luck." Kane grinned despite himself. "You're insane." "I'm alive, ain't I?" That was the thing about humans, Kane thought. They adapted, they endured, and when all else failed, they improvised. Movement in the distance caught his eye. The HFY forces were advancing again, their towering insectoid forms moving in eerie unison, armed with energy weapons that could liquefy bone in seconds. Kane should have been afraid. Any other species would have surrendered by now. But humans weren't like other species. Kane turned to his squad. "All right, listen up. We've got no fancy guns, no air support, and no reinforcements coming. But you know what we do have. Silence." Then Private O'Malley, a wiry, red-headed man who had a knack for inappropriate jokes, spoke up. Fists." Kane smirked. "Dan right, we have fists. We also have rocks, steel pipes, industrial cables, and a whole lot of pissed-off attitude. So here's the plan. When they get close, we show them what happens when you piss off a species that evolved to throw things really hard." A ripple of dark laughter spread through the squad. It wasn't a joke. It was a strategy. The HFY didn't throw things. Their arms weren't built for it. Their combat doctrine relied on ranged energy weapons and superior numbers. They weren't prepared for humans who turned physics itself into a weapon. Kane grabbed a jagged piece of reinforced concrete, tested its weight, and nodded in approval. His ancestors had once hunted mammoths with crude spears and slings. Now he was about to hunt aliens the same way. He looked up at his soldiers. "Let's remind these bastards why they should have wiped us out when they had the chance." The HFY commander gave the order for the final push. The sky above crackled with energy discharges as their forces marched forward in perfect formation, believing the battle was already won. They were wrong. A moment of eerie stillness settled over the battlefield. Then suddenly, the air was filled with flying projectiles. Massive chunks of metal, bricks, jagged rocks, and even twisted rebar soared through the sky like primitive artillery. The first HFY soldier barely had time to register the incoming threat before a concrete slab smashed through his skull, splattering blue ichor across the battlefield. Another was struck in the throat by a metal pipe, collapsing in a gurgling heap. The aliens panicked. Their plasma rifles were useless at close range. Their exoskeletal armor wasn't built to withstand the sheer force of high-velocity blunt trauma. And worst of all, they didn't understand what was happening. Humans had no weapons. And yet, they were winning. Kane ducked as a plasma bolt whizzed past his head. He grabbed a rusted gear, spun around, and hurled it with all his strength. The heavy projectile slammed into an enemy's eye socket, caving in the skull. Beside him, O'Malley let out a war cry and launched an old industrial wrench at full speed. The tool smashed through an alien's ribcage, sending it sprawling onto the ground. It was absolute chaos. The Xelvari ranks crumbled under the relentless assault. Their advanced weapons meant nothing against a species that weaponized sheer willpower. A desperate transmission came through the Xelvari command network. "This is General Vornix. Withdraw. Withdraw immediately." The humans. They're using EVE or everything as a weapon. We can't fight this. But there was nowhere to run. The final moments of the battle were pure brutality. Xelvari soldiers, once so confident in their victory, now fled in terror, only to be taken down by thrown debris, ambush attacks, and makeshift weapons. When the last alien collapsed, Kane stood amidst the wreckage, his body aching but victorious. His squad, battered but alive, gathered around him. O'Malley picked up a blood-stained wrench, whistling. "So, I'm thinking we add high-velocity blunt trauma to the human battle doctrine." Thoughts. Kane exhaled, looking over the battlefield littered with bodies of technologically superior foes who had underestimated the raw ingenuity of humankind. Let's make sure they put that in the history books. He turned to his surviving soldiers, voice steady and unwavering. "We're not done yet. Gather what you can. Anything we can throw, anything we can break, we're gonna need it. Because if the Xelvari wanted to take this planet, they were going to have to fight for every inch of it. And humans, they were very, very good at fighting." The battle evolves. The eerie silence that followed the Xelvari retreat was almost unnatural. Smoke and dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the wind like ghostly remnants of the battle that had just taken place. The once pristine metallic landscape of Velmera 7's industrial zone was now a graveyard of shattered bodies and crude, improvised weaponry. Captain Elias Kane took a deep breath, adjusting his grip on the blood-stained length of rebar he had used as a club. His muscles burned from exhaustion, but his mind was sharp, adrenaline keeping him upright. His squad gathered around him, panting and bruised but victorious. They had done the impossible. They had fought an alien army with nothing but debris and won. O'Malley, still holding his signature rusted wrench, let out a low whistle as he nudged a fallen Xelvari warrior with the toe of his boot. "So, they ran, huh? I didn't think bug boys could actually feel fear." Kane exhaled sharply, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "Oh, they feel fear, all right. We just taught them how." The survivors chuckled, but beneath their bravado, exhaustion weighed heavy on them. The truth was, they had only won one skirmish in a much larger war. And if the Xelvari retreated, it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they were changing tactics. A voice crackled through the battered remains of Kane's comm unit. "Kane, status report. The enemy pulled back from your sector." It was Lieutenant Callahan, one of the few other remaining human officers on the planet. "Affirmative," Kane responded. "Minimal casualties. We made them bleed. Hard." A brief pause. Then Callahan's voice returned, grim and laced with tension. "We've got a problem." Kane wiped a streak of sweat from his brow, his stomach nodding. "Of course we do. Lay it on me." They've stopped engaging on all fronts. Our scouts report that their main forces have retreated beyond the outer ridges. Kane frowned. "They're regrouping." Worse. Callahan's voice dipped lower, as if speaking too loudly would summon something terrible. "They're adapting." A cold sensation crawled up Kane's spine. Adapting. He had seen it before, a dangerous moment in warfare where the enemy, after taking unexpected losses, stopped underestimating its opponent and instead evolved to counter them. O'Malley crossed his arms, overhearing the conversation. "So what's the play, boss? They gonna come back with shields and helmets to stop us from caving in their skulls?" Kane didn't laugh. "No, they're smarter than that." He turned back to the comm. "Lieutenant, what's the latest intel? What are they planning?" A rustling sound, then Callahan's voice, tight with urgency. "They're burning everything." Kane's breath caught. "What?" "Scorched earth. They're setting fire to every structure, melting down resources, collapsing tunnels. They're wiping out anything that we could possibly use against them." O'Malley swore under his breath. "Son of a..." "So that's their plan. If they can't kill us directly, they'll just starve us out." It was brilliant in its cruelty. The humans had survived this long by turning the battlefield itself into a weapon. But if the Selvari destroyed the battlefield, there would be nothing left to use. A dry, bitter laugh escaped Kane's throat. So they finally figured it out. It wasn't surprising. The Selvari weren't dumb, just arrogant. And now, with their pride wounded, they were about to dismantle the very ground beneath their enemies. A sudden explosion rumbled in the distance, sending tremors through the ground. The humans instinctively ducked, covering their heads as a pillar of black smoke rose high into the sky. Another factory gone. Another potential supply of weapons turned to ash. Kane gritted his teeth. "Damn it. They're not giving us a chance to fight back." He turned to his squad. "We have to move. Now." O'Malley cocked his head. "To where?" "Everything's burning." Kane's jaw tightened. "Then we find something that doesn't burn." The search for a new arsenal. Moving through the ruined city was like walking through a dying world. Flames licked at the edges of collapsed buildings. Thick plumes of smoke coiled toward the sky, blotting out the already dim light of Velmera 7's distant sun. The Selvari weren't just destroying buildings, they were collapsing bridges, toppling supply depots, and setting off controlled detonations in underground tunnels. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were erasing their existence. Kane led his squad through the wreckage, eyes darting over the ruins for anything useful. But every familiar landmark was reduced to rubble. Every factory that had once produced machinery was now a heap of melted slag. Their weapons had been taken away before they could even find them. O'Malley kicked at a smoking pile of debris. "This is bad, boss. They're actually thinking now." Kane exhaled sharply. "That's what makes it interesting." Private Hawthorne, the youngest of the squad, hesitated as they passed by the remains of a massive industrial power station. The towering structure had once been a beacon of human engineering, a marvel of self-sustaining energy. Now it was a crumbling husk, still sparking with the remnants of its final charge. "Captain," Hawthorne called, "what if we turn this against them?" Kane stopped, eyes narrowing as he studied the wreckage. The power station's core was still intact. And Kane suddenly realized the battlefield wasn't just fire and rubble. It was energy. He turned to his squad, eyes burning with an idea. "All right, listen up. We don't have guns. We don't have bombs. But you know what we do have." O'Malley smirked, a very questionable sense of self-preservation. Kane ignored him. "We have lightning." The squad exchanged glances, realization dawning in their eyes. Electricity. The Selvari weren't just destroying solid structures, but electricity. That wasn't something you could just burn away. Hawthorne grinned. "You're saying we use the grid?" Kane nodded. That Selvari aren't used to dealing with electrical weapons. They rely on their armor and kinetic shielding. But if we overload the grid and send a directed surge, we can fry their systems. O'Malley's grin widened. "We're gonna cook him." Kane clapped him on the shoulder. "Damn right we are." The battle had changed. The Selvari thought they could take away everything humans could use as a weapon. They forgot about ingenuity. Kane pointed to the power station. "Hawthorne, see if you can rig that core to release a directed pulse. We're gonna turn this whole city into the biggest goddamn electric fence the galaxy has ever seen. The squad moved into action. Because when humans ran out of weapons, they'd made new ones. And this time, they were about to show that Selvari Dominion what it really meant to fight against Earth's finest. The storm we built. The night sky above Velmera 7 crackled with electricity as the final modifications to the power station's core were completed. The entire industrial sector, once a sprawling complex of factories and metal foundries, had been reduced to a smoldering wasteland. That Selvari had burned everything in their path. But what they didn't realize was that, in doing so, they had given the humans exactly what they needed. Captain Elias Kane knelt beside Private Hawthorne, who was hunched over the remains of a power relay station, carefully connecting the last of the scavenged cables. Sparks flickered as he twisted the final component into place. "It's done, Captain," Hawthorne announced, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The surge will run through the remaining grid when we flip the switch. Anything standing in this sector, it's gonna light up like a goddamn Christmas tree." Kane nodded, a wicked grin forming on his dirt-streaked face. "Perfect. Now all we need is bait." O'Malley, ever the reckless one, cracked his knuckles. "Well, sir, if you need someone to piss off a horde of alien bugs, I'm your guy." Kane smirked. "Good, because that's exactly what we're about to do." The plan was simple. Draw the Selvari forces back into the industrial zone, then hit them with an electrical surge strong enough to fry their systems, and if they were lucky, some of their oversized bug brains too. But to pull that off, they needed the enemy to believe they were vulnerable. And that was where the fun began. The Selvary's fatal mistake. Far beyond the ruined city, deep within their armored encampment, General Vornix watched the burning landscape through the war room's reinforced viewport. His tendrils twitched, his bioluminescent skin flickering in irritation. His forces had done everything right. They had scorched the battlefield, collapsed tunnels, wiped out key infrastructure, and yet the humans were still alive, still fighting. Vornix turned toward his chief strategist, an older Selvari named Hazran, who had survived more wars than most species had even existed for. "Explain this," Vornix commanded, his voice heavy with frustration. "Why have they not surrendered?" Hazran studied the reports with cold calculation. "The humans, they do not think as we do. Desperation fuels them. When cornered, most species fall apart. They do not. They adapt. They endure." Vornix scoffed. "Adapt? They are out of weapons, out of resources. What could they possibly use against us now?" Hazran hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he looked up. Themselves. A challenge that Selvari couldn't ignore. The first transmission came through at dawn. A single distorted radio signal, broadcasted across all open Selvari frequencies, and on it was Captain Elias Kane's voice. "This is Captain Kane of the 17th Human Expeditionary Corps. To the Selvari Dominion. Come and get us." A pause, then a soft chuckle, dripping with mockery. "Or are you afraid of the primitive species that just turned your best warriors into roadkill?" The channel fell silent. For several long seconds, no response came from the Selvari command. And then, all at once, the camp erupted into chaos. General Vornix roared in fury, his bioluminescent tendrils flaring in violent bursts of red. Every Selvari officer in the war room flinched at the display of raw anger. "Send everything," Vornix hissed. "I want them annihilated. I want their bodies burned, their bones crushed. I want their name erased from history." He turned to his lead strike commander. "Prepare the advance. I want boots on the ground in 1 hour." The Selvari thought they were marching to a swift and total victory. They had no idea they were walking straight into a storm of their own making. The lightning trap. Kane's squad was positioned throughout the ruins, hidden in the wreckage of collapsed buildings, waiting. Their hearts pounded in unison as they listened to the distant rumble of approaching Selvari war machines. O'Malley adjusted his grip on his makeshift weapon, a steel crowbar sharpened into a crude spear. "You know, I can't believe this is actually working." Kane smirked. "I can't believe they're dumb enough to fall for it." Hawthorne, who had taken position by the power relay switch, wiped sweat from his brow. "Captain, once I flip this thing, we won't have much time. The surge will overload the grid, but it'll only last for about 10 seconds. Kane nodded. 10 seconds is all we need. The first Selvari scout units entered the ruins, their sleek, insectoid forms moving with eerie precision. Their plasma rifles glowed a dull red, scanning the environment for movement. They saw nothing. They kept advancing. More followed. 100, 200, a full battalion. They filled the streets, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground. War machines rolled in behind them, massive quadrupedal walkers armed with high-energy railguns. Still, they saw nothing. And then, at the very heart of the ruined city, they heard it. A single human whistle. Kane stepped out from cover, standing atop a crumbling wall, arms crossed. A Selvari officer snarled, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, Kane grinned and raised a single handheld detonator. Boom. Hawthorne flipped the switch. The wrath of Velmera 7. The industrial grid ignited. A blinding surge of pure electricity exploded through the ruins, arcs of lightning leaping between fallen structures, crackling through the very ground itself. That Selvari never stood a chance. Every soldier caught in the initial blast convulsed violently, their exoskeletal armor frying from the inside out. Weapons short-circuited. Vehicles stalled, their mechanical limbs locking up in place as their energy cores overloaded and detonated. The air was filled with the screams of dying warriors, their bodies smoking as they collapsed onto the scorched ground. The war machines, once towering over the battlefield, collapsed under their own weight, their pilots fused into their cockpits by the sheer power of the surge. It lasted only 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds, an entire Selvari battalion ceased to exist. When the lights finally dimmed, the only sounds that remained were the crackling of burnt metal and the distant hum of still discharging energy. O'Malley let out a slow, stunned exhale. Holy. Kane stepped forward, surveying the devastation. The once mighty Selvari lay in heaps of smoldering ruin, their once perfect formation reduced to nothing but corpses and wreckage. He exhaled. That'll teach them to underestimate a species that harnessed fire and never looked back. The battle wasn't over. But the message had been sent loud and clear. Humans didn't just fight with weapons. They turned the entire world into one. The will to survive. The battlefield was silent. The storm of electricity and fire had subsided, leaving behind only the ruins of a Selvari battalion that had once marched in perfect unison. The air still crackled with residual energy, the scent of scorched metal and burnt flesh thick in the ruins of Velmera 7's industrial wasteland. Captain Elias Kane stood among the wreckage, gripping the makeshift rebar club that had become his weapon of choice. His squad, battered but victorious, emerged from the rubble with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had done it. They had destroyed an entire Selvari strike force with nothing but a power grid and human ingenuity. Holy hell, O'Malley whispered, stepping over the charred remains of what had once been an elite alien warrior. We actually pulled it off. Private Hawthorne, who had been the one to flip the switch and ignite the battlefield, wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still trembling from adrenaline. Yeah, he muttered, exhaling shakily, but they'll be back. Kane nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew this victory wouldn't last long. That Selvari were wounded, but they were not defeated. If anything, this would make them even angrier. And angry enemies made dangerous ones. The fallout. Back in the Selvari command center, General Vornik stood before a holographic war map, his tendrils pulsating with a mix of rage and disbelief. The once strategic, methodical assault on Velmera 7 had descended into absolute chaos. The latest report detailed a catastrophe. A full battalion lost, War machines destroyed. Elite strike forces wiped out. And all of it was because of a species that had run out of guns. Unacceptable. Vornix hissed, his voice trembling with fury. His claws curled into the war table, the metal groaning under the pressure. Tazrin, his chief strategist, hesitated before speaking. General, perhaps we have underestimated them. Vornix's bioluminescence flared red. We did nothing of the sort. Tazrin inclined his head slightly. Then explain how they have turned our own battlefield against us. Explain why our forces were electrocuted by their city's power grid. Explain why, despite every tactical advantage, we are still unable to crush a handful of survivors. The room fell into an uneasy silence, because no one had an answer. Vornix bared his sharpened fangs, glaring at the flickering reports of their defeat. They cannot win, he muttered. We will not allow them to. Tazrin studied him carefully. Then what is your order, General? Vornix exhaled sharply. Deploy the purge. A murmur spread through the War Council. Even among the Selvari elite, the purge was considered a drastic, ruthless tactic, one reserved for planets deemed too costly to conquer through conventional war. Tazrin's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. You wish to erase them. Vornix's eyes gleamed with dark resolve. Burn every inch of Velmera 7. If we cannot take it, then we will leave nothing behind for them to cling to. Nowhere left to run. Kane's squad was gathered in the remnants of an old command post, salvaging whatever they could. The battlefield may have been theirs for now, but it wouldn't be for long. We need to move, Kane said, scanning the destroyed cityscape. Once they recover from this mess, they're going to wipe us off this rock. Hawthorne, still working on his scavenged communications unit, suddenly froze. Captain. Kane turned to him. What? Hawthorne swallowed hard, adjusting the radio's frequency. I just intercepted an Selvari transmission. The squad stiffened. What does it say? Kane demanded. Hawthorne looked up, face pale. They're not sending reinforcements. A heavy silence fell over them. Then what are they sending? O'Malley asked warily. Hawthorne's voice was barely above a whisper. Fire. A distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. Then another, and another. Kane's blood ran cold. He looked up, past the ruined skyline, and saw it. The sky was burning. The Selvari's final solution. From orbit, the Selvari warships began their bombardment, unleashing an unstoppable wave of destruction upon the planet. This was not a tactical strike. This was extermination. The first impact hit the far edge of the ruined city. A massive column of fire and ash erupted into the sky, the force of the explosion leveling entire districts in seconds. The second detonated what remained of the industrial district, turning steel into molten slag. The third, closer now, sent a shockwave that knocked Kane and his squad off their feet. O'Malley groaned, rolling onto his side. Oh, for few. Are they serious? We just rebuilt half this damn city with their corpses, and now they're setting it on fire. Kane pulled himself up, coughing through the smoke and dust. He didn't need to answer, because the truth was obvious, that Selvari had abandoned their conquest. They were going to wipe Velmera 7 clean, along with every last human still breathing. Kane's mind raced. There had to be a way out. A ship? No. That Selvari had destroyed every transport long ago. A bunker? No. The bombardment would collapse every underground structure. They were out of options. Out of time. And then, Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. Captain, I think I have an idea. Kane turned to him, desperate for any answer. Hawthorne, still crouched over the battered comm station, gestured wildly at the old industrial power cores buried deep within the city ruins. Those cores, they're still active, right? Kane frowned. Yeah. So, Hawthorne's eyes gleamed with mad inspiration. What happens if we detonate them all at once? Silence. Then, O'Malley barked out a laugh. Oh, I love where this is going. Kane's mind snapped into action, piecing it together. The power cores, still charged with unstable energy. The bombardment, igniting everything in its path. If they could channel the explosions properly, they could amplify the chain reaction into something far worse than what the Selvari had planned. They could turn the entire city into a supernova. Kane grinned. "You're crazy, Hawthorne." Hawthorne smirked. "I learned from the best." O'Malley cracked his knuckles. "All right, let's make some fireworks." The plan was madness. It was suicidal. But it was also their only shot. Because if the Selvari were going to erase them from existence, then the humans would make damned sure they went out with a bang.